Hey everybody, and welcome back to another video from Northeast Christian Apologetics. We're continuing our series on omniscience, and this is part 2 of that series. A lot of what we're going to be saying here in part 2 is not going to make a lot of sense unless you've seen part 1. So I recommend you take a look at part 1 before you watch this video. Or not. It's up to you. Please remember that this ministry is meant to go out to the world and the public. So a way that you can help this ministry reach that goal is by hitting the subscribe button and also sharing it on your social media. Thank you very much. So in our last video, we gave a little teaser about an atheistic challenge to God's omniscience. So this omniscience challenge is presented by Patrick Grimm. Patrick Grimm begins his attack on God's omniscience using a definition that may be very familiar to us. He uses a very similar definition to those of our brother theologians. Just as a recap, we talked about this in the last video, but we'll rehash the definition here. Patrick Grimm says, "What would it be for a being to be omniscient? The core notion is undoubtedly that of a being that knows all that is knowable, or all that can be known." He goes on to say, "But it is clear that we speak of a variety of things as knowledge. Knowing that something is the case, that's propositional knowledge, knowing how to do something, and knowing both things and feelings by acquaintance." So in the last video, I mentioned that this is where his argument starts to bare his teeth. But what do I mean by that? Because so far we haven't said anything controversial. Seems pretty fair to say, and that's why it's persuasive. His challenge to omniscience at this point deals with the second and the third statement in what he just said. First, knowing how to do something, and second, knowing something by acquaintance. With regard to knowing how to do something, Grimm says, if God is a being without a body, he cannot know how to juggle, how to balance on the parallel bars, or how to compensate for a strained muscle in the right calf. Now, some people might find parts of his current argument to be kind of silly. After all, most Christians believe that God became incarnate in the Lord Jesus Christ. So God knows very well what it feels like to be a human being. Perhaps Jesus had a sprained ankle. Christians also are very familiar with the idea that God has visited the earth in a humanoid type form. You can see an example of this in Genesis chapter 18. But at the same time, I think it's pretty safe to assume that Jesus didn't know how to drive a car, he didn't know how to fly an airplane, he probably didn't even know how to play baseball. Then again, if God is capable of manifesting himself in some corporeal form, like it is indicated in the Genesis account, then there's no way of saying definitively what God doesn't know how to do. Also, it hasn't been demonstrated that it's necessary for somebody to do something in order for them to know how to do something. You can learn how to do something very easily without actually doing it. We do that all the time if you have a very complicated job, or if you're for example, if you're training for a doomsday scenario, you might not know what it's like to go through that scenario in exactly those terms, like routing wire while a hurricane is blowing, but you still know how to do it. You just haven't done it in those scenarios. So in my opinion, Grimm's know-how argument isn't a very strong defeater against a Christian's understanding of God's omniscience, especially the omniscience that we talked about in the last video. However, Grimm's argument from knowledge by acquaintance is a little different. So in the Cambridge Companion for Atheism, we read from Grimm, knowledge by acquaintance also raises clear impossibilities for any traditional omniscient God. Among those feelings that non-omniscient beings know all too well are lust and envy, fear, frustration, and despair. If a God is without moral fault, he cannot know lust or envy, and thus cannot qualify as omniscient. If a God is without limitation, he cannot know fear, frustration, or despair. Personally, I think that this argument is effective for anyone who holds or agrees with Patrick Grimm's definition of omniscience. However, you'll notice that the word know is being used in a slightly different way than what we established in the last video. The word know here that he is using isn't simply justified true belief. It's an intimate type of know. This is the type of knowledge that we encounter in the Garden of Eden, when Adam and Eve are tempted by the serpent to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. This type of knowledge is the type of knowledge that is obtained through personal, direct experience. I know personally and intimately what it's like to sin because I have sinned. But God doesn't know personally and intimately what it's like for him to sin because he can't sin. He might understand what it's like for people to sin, but he himself doesn't know what it's like for him to sin. So I find myself agreeing with Patrick Grimm on this matter. God doesn't know what it's like to lie because he is not a man that he should lie, and he doesn't lie, nor can he lie. God would know what it's like for other people to lie, what they are feeling, but he doesn't know what it's like for him to lie. And therefore God doesn't know this thing in the intimate sense that Patrick Grimm is talking about here. But this is exactly why we need to insist on the philosophical definition of knowledge when we're talking about omniscience. Knowledge being justified, true belief. And we need to hold tight to the definition of omniscience that we established in the last video. And just as a recap, the definition of the last video that we established was, for any proposition, God knows whether or not it corresponds with reality. Grimm's knowledge by acquaintance challenge loses its fangs. As a matter of fact, it never had fangs to begin with. However, Patrick Grimm anticipates this move and says, a first move is to limit omniscience to propositional knowledge. Omniscience has often been defined, for example, as follows. A being X is omniscient when it is defined as, for all propositions, a proposition is true if and only if X knows that proposition. However, not being satisfied with this definition, Grimm goes on to make it a little bit more precise. So Grimm updates the definition to the following. If being X is omniscient, then it is defined as, for all propositions, the proposition is true if and only if X believes that proposition, and X believes that proposition if and only if X knows that proposition. So you can see how things can start to get a little complicated. But I want to draw attention to something that Patrick Grimm is doing that is very good. And it's very good for anyone, no matter what you believe. You should try to understand your opponent or the person who doesn't agree with you. You should understand their position as fully as you can, and you should also try to consider their position from as strong of a position as you can understand it to be. So that's what Patrick Grimm is doing here. Armed with this new definition, Patrick Grimm goes on to challenge God's omniscience in a different way and offers us this story to illustrate what he's talking about. I follow a trail of spilled sugar around and around a tall aisle in the supermarket in search of the shopper who is making a mess. Suddenly I realize that the trail of sugar that I have been following is spilling from a torn sack in my cart, and that I am the culprit. I am making the mess. 1. I realize at that point that I am making a mess. The interesting point is that this proposition is not the same as 2. Patrick Grimm is making a mess. Nor can it be the same proposition as number 3. He is making a mess, where I am the he that is indicated. Grimm goes on to say that these are different propositions. But are they really? We can definitely agree that these are all different statements. But are they really providing different propositions? In our last video, we discussed what a proposition is. Remember that a proposition is the content of a sentence. A proposition is the content of a statement. It's what the statement is trying to deliver. Whenever you make a statement, that statement has within it the proposition, if you're making a statement that could be either true or false. It contains the proposition. For example, the statement, John loves Jessica, is a proposition, but it could also be worded as, Jessica is loved by John, or John is a lover of Jessica. Those are 3 different statements, but they all portray the same proposition, namely that John loves Jessica. These are all statements that bear the same content. We could even change the language and the proposition stays the same. That's how we translate from language to language. The statements or words can change, but the proposition remains the same. The difference in this case is that there needs to be additional propositions that are added by the context, such as I am Patrick Grimm and he is Patrick Grimm. We have to define what it is that I and he mean. However, with all that said, there's a different point that Patrick Grimm is trying to make here. And the point that he's trying to make is that there's also more knowledge behind the I am making a mess statement. The first person awareness, the first person perspective, that is knowledge that he is trying to drive at here. And that this knowledge is something that God doesn't have. God doesn't have the knowledge that I am making a mess because God isn't Patrick Grimm. So it's Patrick Grimm making a mess, and when he says I am making a mess, that's different than if God were to say I am making a mess, because in that situation, God would have to be Patrick Grimm. But God isn't Patrick Grimm. God is God. If God did think that he was Patrick Grimm or Simon Williams or Napoleon Dynamite, then that would not lend credibility to his excellence. It would draw into question his sanity. However, something that we need to understand is that not all knowledge is propositional. When you define knowledge as something like justified true belief, that doesn't necessarily tie it to propositions. The first person awareness of I am Simon is not a propositional piece of knowledge. It's a non-propositional piece of knowledge. Sure, the statement I am Simon contains a proposition that could either be true or false, but what we're getting at is the awareness. The statement I am Simon that has that proposition is a proposition that God knows, and God knows whether or not it's true or false, but it's only true or false depending on whether or not Simon is the one who's saying it. If I say I am Simon, then that's a proposition that's true. If God says I am Simon, then that would be a proposition that's false. So it must be the case that any statement that bears a proposition, that proposition must correspond with reality in order for it to be true. And certain statements deal with perspective, either first person perspective or a third person perspective, and that is taken into consideration when we analyze propositions. However, that first person or third person knowledge of awareness, like my self-awareness, is a non-propositional knowledge. And since first person perspective is a non-propositional piece of knowledge, then it doesn't impact God's omniscience. Because remember that God's omniscience definition deals with propositions. So even though it might be the case that God lacks the knowledge of I am making a mess when he is not making a mess, that doesn't impact whether or not he's omniscient. He's still omniscient because he knows whether or not the proposition I am making a mess is true in the context of who's saying it and when, and whether or not it corresponds with reality. But once again, Patrick Grimm anticipates this move of the theist, and he goes on to say this, and he's such a smarty pants. Omniscience, even if limited to propositional, and even if propositions were taken to exclude knowledge involving essential indexicals, that's talking about the I am statements, would require a being to know all objective truths. It can clearly be established, however, that there can be no plurality of all truths. There is no all of the sort omniscience would require. So this is dealing with propositions as a group idea. And this is a much more sophisticated argument, and one that I think is a very interesting argument. So I want to go into more detail about this. And that's why it's going to be in part 3. I know, another cliffhanger, but this particular argument takes a lot more to fully flesh out, and then it takes a little bit more to knock it down. So I want to spend a little bit more time on this and start fresh with a new video. So that's my reasoning behind that. And with that, finally, I think it's time for a little recap. We've been talking about Patrick Grimm's challenges to God's omniscience. First, we discussed Patrick Grimm's argument that God can't know how to do something because God is not a physical being. We also discussed how that is a silly kind of objection because God can take on physical forms, and you don't need to directly experience something in order to know how to do something. Second, we discussed his argument that God can't know how to do something by acquaintance. And we also said that he was right. This was something that we would agree with, but only if we agreed with his definition of know and omniscience, which we don't. In the video, we discussed how we define omniscience and know. With the way that we define know and omniscience, this challenge is a non-issue. We then started to look at what Grimm's challenges to omniscience were when we shift gears to strictly propositional knowledge. We refuted his challenge by developing a more precise understanding of propositions and how they relate to sentences/statements. We also discussed the idea that our self-awareness is a non-propositional type of knowledge. And we talked about how this impacts how we deliver propositions through statements and sentences, and therefore doesn't disturb our definition of omniscience. Further, please remember that the way that we defined omniscience is supported both philosophically and theologically. Next time, we're going to discuss Grimm's last effort to try to undermine God's omniscience. I hope that this video has been helpful to you and that this series helps you to understand just how great our God is, and that there's a lot to learn and there's a lot to know. The path to learning about God is a lifelong kind of situation, so we don't need to rush into anything. If you ever have any questions, please don't hesitate to leave them in the comments below. You can also visit us online at nechristianapologetics.com. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button, and we'll see you next time. Thank you, and God bless.